Today's scripture is 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 18. But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do, who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so, through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. For this we declare to you by a word from the Lord, that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, and with the sound of a trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will always be with the Lord. Therefore, encourage one another with these words.
Rarely have I been embarrassed by my mom. It's only a couple occasions. I may have told you that I shared this with her already, so she's fine with me sharing. I've probably told this story before, but maybe just a little bit of a different context. I wrestled in high school. I started my sophomore year, junior, and senior year. Only 3 years that I wrestled. I wrestled at 171 my junior and senior year. It was my junior year. We were in the small gym at my high school, which was kind of the wrestling gym. The mats were laid down. The school had come. I don't recall the school that we were wrestling that night. But as typical of any match, an individual match at least, you would have the whole teams line up on each side, and you would walk out and you would shake the hand of the guy you're going to wrestle that evening. So the whole team would do that. Well, that evening we didn't have a heavyweight, and they didn't have someone wrestling at 171. And so my coach is like, for the sake of the team, we want you to wrestle heavyweight. So I'm 171, and I walk out, and there's this behemoth of a man. He reminds me of the guy in Rocky IV. In fact, my dad had the opportunity to take a quick snapshot right before the match, and this was, I know I've aged well. Anyway, thankful for him, high-resolution pictures at that time. That guy has always been in my mind as I recall this situation, probably not quite accurately, but he was this large, he was not a chunky, fat 270. He looked like a farm boy. He was tall. He was probably 6-7 inches taller than me. He weighed 270, and I walk out on the mat to shake this guy's hand. And my loving mother, I don't know if she stood or not, but she yelled from her sidelines, the greatest fan that I've ever had, "Don't let him wrestle my boy!" That was about the only thing heard in this small gym. That was embarrassing. But I've never, since that moment, I probably didn't before, questioned my mother's love. Oh, see, I appreciate you asking the question. See, now, my purpose in telling this story is singular. I want to communicate to you that my mother loves me. So I don't need to share with you the information following that. Right? Because we choose the information in a story that proves our point. Now, for your sake, I did. I won 3-2. He was big, but he was slow, and I was really fast, and I just avoided him for three periods. And I remember accepting I'm down, and I was able to escape. It was pretty amazing. I wish you could have all been there. I did win the match, but that's not the point, and that's kind of my point this morning. Whenever we tell a story, we pick and choose the information that we desire to make the point that we have. Why am I telling you this? It's really not for you to know about my wrestling prowess. If I were to tell you the story again, depending on what my purpose was in that moment, I would choose to tell it differently. If it's Mother's Day and I want to talk about a mother's love, I'm going to pick certain facts of the story to communicate a mother's love as I did this morning. Now, if I want to get up and tell some friends at a dinner about how amazing of a wrestler I was in high school, and I would probably pick that one match right there, right? Because it was just the greatest one. And I would probably not include, well, I don't know, it's pretty funny, but I would probably not include my mom yelling from the sideline. Like, that takes away from the grandeur of my wrestling prowess, probably, right? So I would choose that information to hold back. Consider a general writing principle or a general storytelling principle. In any story, an author includes or should only include the details that are pertinent to his point. Other details exist, but often the author chooses to exclude the details that may detract from his overall purpose. You with me? Connect this to the Gospels. There's 4 Gospels. Each Gospel author writes a similar fashion and a similar story about the life of Jesus. Each of them chose to include or not include specific information which would best enhance the purpose for which they wrote the Gospel. Now, before we jump into the Gospel accounts of the resurrection and how this principle of inclusion or exclusion impacts the resurrection accounts, let's first acknowledge a potential danger. Any reader must be extremely careful as they potentially draw conclusions about what an author does not say. Now, I've given you most of the details that I can recall of that momentous occasion in my life as a junior in high school. Now, if I were to tell that story again, and you're with me at this dinner party, and I'm trying to make myself look good in this, arrogantly so, and you'd be like, well, wait, you got to tell me about your mom. That was pretty funny. That's like the best part. No one really cares if you want. They want to hear about your mom. Well, if you're there and you hear me tell the story, and I have a specific purpose in mind, you have to be extremely careful not to draw conclusions as to why I chose not to include something. Like, you may be able to guess. You might be like, well, I think Aaron probably chose not to include this, this, and this because he was trying to accomplish his purpose. But you can't know. So when we come to John and we look at what John does not include, we've got to be really careful that we don't draw hard and fast conclusions as to why John didn't include something specific. And I think we're going to try to be informed and draw some informed conclusions cautiously as to why he doesn't include things. But we have to be really careful in this. So I want to look at a couple of things that John does not include in his account, and then I want to just acknowledge a couple that he does. And I think by the fact that he chooses certain things, he desires to emphasize a specific point in the text. What are the things that John does not include in his gospel account? Now, let's do this. Go to John 20. I'm going to read for you verse 1. I'll probably read down to about 18, but let's just start at 1 and probably stop about 16 instead. Now, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." So Peter went out with the other disciple, and they were going toward the tomb. Both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And stooping to look in, he saw the linen clothes lying there, but he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. He saw the linen clothes lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen clothes, but folded up in a place by itself. Then the other disciple, who had reached the tomb first, also went in, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes. But Mary stood weeping outside the tomb. And as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb, and she saw 2 angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." And Jesus said to her, "Mary." Jesus said to her, "Mary." It's a significant moment. Mary gets it in this moment. She turned and said to him in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. I'm going to leave it at that. There's a few things that John chooses not to include in this. If we look at the other gospel accounts, we see the other stories told, and so we know that there's information that John chooses not to share. So we can, with certainty, say John chose not to share a few things. For instance, Mary Magdalene is the only woman mentioned in this text. But we know from the other gospel accounts that there were a number of other women that came with Mary. In fact, Mary and a number of other women, Salome, another Mary, and it says in one of the accounts, women. So there was this plural group of women who came to the tomb early. Now, when they came was probably between 3 and 6 in the morning. So that might help us understand why Mary looks and sees Jesus but doesn't really recognize him potentially. It was pretty early, this whole account, so it's fairly early in the morning. But John chooses not to include these other women. Now, I'm going to hold off on drawing any conclusions yet. Secondly, that group of women had an interaction with an angel there, and John chooses not to mention it at all. Now, if you look at the text, there is an angelic interaction, but it's just with Mary in the tomb. It seems as if what happens is this woman comes to the tomb. They see that the body is gone. They, as a group, go back, and they tell the disciples as a whole. And each of the disciples, in the other accounts, it says that they thought it was a silly notion. It was idle talk, and they did not believe. John says, and he's the only one to mention this, that both Peter and John came back with Mary. So there's this second encounter to the tomb with Mary, Peter, and John. And they're probably not necessarily all together because we know Peter and John run, and John gets there first. It seems John was younger or quicker, whatever. He gets there first, and we'll unfold that in just a second. That whole scenario with Peter and John is in no other of the Gospels. Now, let's offer a theory. What is John's purpose in his gospel? After 2.5 years, I hope you could all state it. John's purpose in the gospel: I have written these things that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and in believing you will have life. So what is John's purpose? He desires, through his gospel account, to offer a bunch of scenarios in which people interacted with Jesus, or they saw Jesus perform miracles or do something, and they stand in awe of Jesus and are drawn to belief in Jesus. That's the purpose of John's gospel. Therefore, because that's the purpose, John chooses the information in this account that will help his purpose. Is that fair to say? I think that's fair to say. Well, then it seems as if he excludes things because they don't fit his purpose in this moment. I think, I surmise somewhat, but I think it's likely, this group of women, telling all about the women in this story, would draw away from the specific interaction between Mary and Jesus. And John seems to want to shed light on the specific interaction between Mary and Jesus. And drawing all these other women might have clouded his purpose in that. So he seems to just exclude that information. Also, when the disciples go back and tell the disciples, is it helpful to John, if he's trying to show examples of how people saw Jesus and believed, to have the women who are disciples of Jesus go to the disciples of Jesus and the disciples don't believe? Well, it seems like that would probably be counterproductive to John's purpose in his gospel. So I think, likely, John doesn't include that interaction with the women and the disciples because it's just not helpful to his point, so he excludes that as well. Can you go back a slide? I summarized that in there. Okay, you're good. Thank you. He does include two things, and I think with the purpose in mind of wanting to highlight two interactions. As I said, John's gospel is the only one that includes Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved, which we've numbers of times have talked about this. It appears that that was John. So I'm going to just assume that it was. So John and Peter run to the tomb. This is the only gospel that talks about both John and Peter. I believe it's Luke acknowledges that Peter goes back to the tomb, but none of the other gospels acknowledge that John went back to the tomb. And it seems as if he wants to highlight John's own personal testimony. John writes an entire book about how people came to Jesus. This is John's personal testimony of him believing in the resurrection. So I think he desires to include that. He also, this is what he includes. Once again I said, this is the only gospel in which Mary is by herself and there's this interaction. So John seems to purpose, and in this, she hears Jesus and she believes. John sees and he believes. Mary hears and she believes. Let's look at these two accounts. John sees and believes. So this is John's story. Mary has arrived at the tomb, sees it empty. She runs back. She tells the disciples along with the women, but specifically there must have been an interaction with Peter and John. John and Peter run to the tomb. This is important for us. Let's look to the text. Go to verse 2, chapter 20. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple John, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." So Peter went out with the other disciple, and they were going toward the tomb. Both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached. So John reaches the tomb first, verse 5, and stooping to look in, he saw. Now there's three places in which we see the word saw. He saw the linen clothes. What happens next, if you read the text, Peter passes by John, and he sees the empty tomb, and he sees the linen laying there. And then John, the third time we see sees, he saw, it says, he comes in, and he saw that verse 8, then the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. We kind of lose it in the English, but this is three different terms used there. The first term used there has the connotation of basically not blind. So in essence, if we imagine John and Peter are running, John gets to the tomb first, and he just simply sees there's a reality here. The stone is no longer in front of the door, and there's no body there. That's the extent of John's sight. The next term has the context or the implication of perception or to gaze upon. Peter runs through past John, and he stands there and he sees some things. And notice what he sees. He doesn't see that it's just an empty tomb. He sees that the face cloth is right where it would have been, but Jesus' body's not there, and that the cloths are just lying there. There's a beginning to have a perception of what's going on. There's a third different word used for sight in this. John comes in and he sees. And that word there for sees in this case, it carries the connotation of taking note by observation or experientially coming to know or realize something. So this is what I imagine. John comes to the tomb. He sees an empty tomb. That's it. That's all he gets. Peter comes in and he sees the body is gone, and the linens are like right where they would be if they're not folded up. So he begins to perceive and to meditate on these things. John comes in and it clicks. The light bulb goes off. He gets it. He's like, I know what happened. And he believed. That's beautiful. He understood. But he doesn't see Jesus. He doesn't hear any theology taught at this point. It's all the theology that had been taught to him at some other point in the past comes to fruition in this point. The things that Jesus had said, it says the disciples as a whole struggled with this, but John saw, he perceived, he understood, he tied all the knots together, and he believed in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There's a second scenario in which we have this. Mary, it's one of my favorite. It's probably my second or third favorite in John. In the next week or so, we get to look at my favorite, Peter and Jesus' interaction on the shore. Love that. That's in chapter 21. I love the Samaritan woman story in chapter 4 with Jesus coming to the Samaritan woman. And this little short narrative is it's just one of the top favorite interactions that we have in the Gospels, personally, that I feel a great deal of emotion in this moment. I think we walk past this very clinically when we read these short 6 verses or so. Mary stood weeping, verse 11, outside the tomb, and as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb, and she saw 2 angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." This is an interesting interaction with angelic beings. She's not concerned. We don't have evidence that she's sitting there amazed at them so much as she's consumed with Jesus. She's not like, "Wow, where are you guys from? Do you know where?" Like, I want to know where Jesus is at. That's what's consuming her. They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him. Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus. So we could just read this just quickly through and just dismiss this. Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing. So she sees so John, let me just compare here a little bit. John doesn't see Jesus. He doesn't see much of anything. He sees some linens, and everything is pieced together for him, and he believes. Mary sees angelic beings. Mary actually sees Jesus. But she doesn't believe until what? Until she hears. Jesus comes to her. "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." She's still consumed with, "I just want to be with Jesus." She's weeping, and she's consumed with a passion for Christ. And it's not until Jesus says to her, "Mary." And in that, she knows who it is. When it says that, she turns and she says to him, "Rabboni," she knows who this is, and she believes. I don't know if I almost had the video of this. I'm not sure what this says about me. I like Sense and Sensibility, the movie. So for the 10 others of you who have watched that, and are probably women, maybe you recall at the end of the movie, the whole movie, this woman just desires to be married to this other guy, and he's committed. He made a foolish promise when he was young, and he couldn't get out of it, so he stayed true to that commitment, and it didn't work out, and she thinks he's married, and she comes. And you can see her. I always cry at this one scene because she's standing there, and she asks him, "So you're not married?" And he says, "No." And she just breaks apart. Completely, like she's like like that, just like heavy breathing, like she can't control herself for like the next 2 minutes of the movie. It's kind of funny, but it's also actually really, really moving. I imagine, like, try not to just see this moment. Mary's crying, and Jesus comes and says it's Mary, and she's like, "Oh, cool, it's Jesus." Numerous times already in the narrative, Jesus is saying, She's weeping. She's not just like crying. She's weeping. She couldn't go with Joseph or Peter and John. They run off, and she just collapses and is weeping. And angelic beings confront her, and she's just like, I just want to see Jesus. The gardener comes and says, what do you want? And she's like, I just want Jesus. And she hears Jesus' voice, and everything I can imagine, everything within her, all of the passion for her Savior in that moment is seen and understood, that he stood in front of her resurrected, and the passion and the emotion she must have sensed in that moment was overpowering. That who she longed for stood in front of her. I just want to draw two simple thoughts from this as we finish this morning. Jesus calls all types of people to himself. And he calls all types of people in all kinds of ways. I think it's interesting that John, based on the information he had, sees and believes. Mary sees a bunch of stuff, and it's when she hears, and I think it's the same as Jesus in John 10, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. That is a in-life example of that principle, when Mary hears the voice of her shepherd. So some of us see things. Some of us look at the grandeur of creation, and we saw the reality of God and his greatness. Others needed to hear some truth. God works in all kinds of ways to draw us unto himself. But he also uses all kinds, or draws all kinds of people. John, it seems as if, I believe there's 10-ish interactions with Jesus by specific people in John. 5 of them women, 5 of them men. You think through this, and you have all kinds of people. You have Nicodemus, who comes to Jesus at night in John chapter 3. A leader, Pharisees, part of the Sanhedrin. There are a great deal of authority and prestige and potentially power that Nicodemus held. And he comes to Jesus by night, and the interaction with Jesus produces a bunch of questions for Nicodemus. You have a blind man that has this brief interaction with Jesus, on a profound but brief interaction with Jesus on the streets, and Jesus draws this blind man to himself. You have Peter, a disciple. You have Nathanael depicted and Nathanael being drawn to Jesus as a disciple, and Jesus having seen him already under the tree. You have this interaction with Thomas, and Thomas' struggle and doubting. But then you have the different women. You have a Samaritan woman who would have been considered lascivious. And Jesus beautifully draws this outcast to himself. And yet, he also has this interaction with his mother. He has this interaction in the moment of a death with Mary and Martha. There's all these different scenarios. And there's this one with Mary Magdalene. All of them different, from a Samaritan woman to the mother of Jesus, to Nicodemus, to doubting Thomas. And Jesus comes and meets us where we're at in the situation of life in which we find ourselves, and he uses different means, and he draws us gloriously to himself. Specifically in this text, we see gloriously to the awareness of the importance of his resurrection. They got it. They understood. Jesus rose again, and they believed. I just want to ask you a question as I close. Is Mary's heart reflective of your own? I just want you to assess that. As I said, I fear we read this story in a clinical way. No awareness to the gravity that of emotion Mary had felt. Now, granted, it doesn't necessarily communicate that John and Peter had the same kind of emotional interaction that Mary did, and that's fine, but they did run to the tomb. There's this thing that is rooted in each disciple, this passion to be with Jesus. It was displayed differently by John and Peter than it was Mary. It was more dramatic, maybe more emotional for Mary, but still, all three of these show this passion to be with Jesus. And I just want to ask you, is that a passion in your life? Are you struggling right now, living here? I just want to be with Jesus. I imagine that someday when Jesus returns, I will be like Mary, weeping. I just want to see Jesus. My concern is that a lot of other things consume us other than that. What consumes you? Is Mary, it was like nothing else mattered but to see Jesus. For us, it seems like nothing else matters than to have specific people in office. Nothing else matters than for my life to be comfortable and COVID to go away. Nothing else matters but X, Y, and Z. And our lives are consumed by these things. And Christ finds himself in the rear, if even present in our lives. And I'm asking you, is the thing in the morning when you wake up, I just want to see Jesus? That's what drives me. That's what consumes me. That seems to be what these people had. And I want us to have that. John would argue for us to have that, cling to Christ, abide in the vine. If I ask you to assess, do you have this passion within you? Is a desire to be with Jesus? Do you struggle? Does the last year made you every week more like, Lord, please return? I don't care about anything else, just return. I would think, as believers, that's probably more and more prevalent in our hearts this year than ever before. I hope so. I would like to believe, and I assume that of you. So I ask you, what is your passion? If you're saying, no, I just don't really seem passionate about spiritual things at all, my life does not seem to have a spiritual appetite or spiritual desires, God reveals himself in his word, and as we go to his word, it gives us a desire to know him more. How's our spiritual diet? How's our time in the word? How's our time in prayer? Is it gone, and then we wonder, like, why don't I really have a passion for spiritual things? It kind of makes sense. If we don't spend time in his word, we don't spend time with his people, and then we have spiritually dry. Thank you, Bill. Like, what word am I listening? Empty. The solution, it takes some time. I want you to crave Christ. And to do that, we have to spend time with him as revealed in his word. And if you choose not to do that, you won't crave him. Lord, you have gloriously revealed yourself in your word, and it is such a gift, and yet it is easy for us. It's very easy for us to be consumed with just a lot of other things that are not important, that have no eternal value, and that are the things that pull us away from those moments where, like, I could spend some time in the Bible right now, but one of 10 other things comes to our mind that seems more pressing in that moment. Lord, you can't just generate a passion for Christ. Like, it's not something we fake, it's something we just make up. We have to walk with you, and it takes time to walk with you. Help us to be about that. Give us a longing for you, a longing to know you, a longing to worship you, a longing to be with you. And to be with your people. In Jesus' name.